everyone, welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today it is my pleasure to be able to speak with author and writer, award-winning writer, Gregory Wolos. Welcome to our program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Gregory, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I live in Massachusetts. I've lived in Massachusetts for about 8 years. Originally, I'm from New York State. We moved here to Massachusetts, my wife and I, after my daughter grew up, went to college out here in Massachusetts. I'm originally from New York, and she got married, had kids, and when I retired, we waited a while and then followed out. So we spent a lot of time helping with the grandchildren. That's what we're doing in Massachusetts. Originally, I'm from Long Island, and then moved up to upstate New York, near Albany, New York, Schenectady, actually, where I taught for 31 years before retiring back in 2009.
Well, and can you tell me a little bit about your career in education?
Sure. I started teaching high school English in 1978 at a school in Schenectady. And I've taught all levels of high school English, but my last few years I spent teaching AP, and then that became IB, International Baccalaureate English. A lot of my work reflects off of things I've taught, and I might get into that when we talk about the novel, my debut novel that's just come out, which has a lot to do with some of the works of literature I've taught. I also coached track and cross country for my first several years till my kids came along, and then didn't seem to have as much time for that. That also reflects back to my writing, actually, because for my first several years of teaching, before kids came along, my summers were spent writing. I just exclusively write the minute I walked out of the door on the last day of school in June. I'd start working, and I'd do that until just before I walked back in the door in September. Then the kids came, and I made some compromises. But in about the middle of my career, I took a sabbatical and went back to get my doctorate at the State University of New York at Albany, focusing primarily on writing. In fact, my dissertation was a creative dissertation. So we did that. And then the question was, do I want to teach college exclusively? Do I want to continue with high school? And as the witches say in Macbeth, we all know security is mankind's chiefest enemy. I continued teaching in high school, which was a good move because I got a very nice pension out of it, retired with the goal at a very young age, 55, with the goal of now I'm going to devote myself entirely to writing. At the time I was working on my sabbatical back in the mid 90s, or early 90s, I should say, I started to publish, and I got a few things published, one of which I might mention later because it's related to things. But pretty much I arranged that as soon as I retired, walked out of that door the last time, that I would just start writing full time, which I did. I prepared had a room built for myself in my basement, a study, and since then, that was 2009. Since then, that's where most of my stories, the 100+ stories I've had published, the 6 works now that one forthcoming that I've had done came out of that full-time work. So I prepared myself for it. I said I'm going to do this, and I did
it. It sounds like though you've had quite a journey along the way to be able to get to this point. I wanted to ask you, Gregory, you've been really focused on writing. Was there ever a time in your life that you weren't quite sure that that's what you would want to do? Like, what led you to being a writer?
The love of the sound of words and the love of story. my mother read to me early. She always read to us. We had tons of books around the house. Everybody in the house was a reader. Um, and I had an ear for it. And early Dr. Seuss, I loved Dr. Seuss when I was little, and I particularly loved the meter and the humor. So I at a very early age, I kind of mastered anapests, and I could duplicate them. And I would write even as early as third and fourth grade. I was writing long Dr. Seuss type stories in verse that I would read in class, and I enjoyed doing that. It it's kind of interesting because even to this day, I still prefer the early Seuss, the works that like On Beyond Zebra, which you create an alphabet that's after the letters we have now, or If I Ran the Circus, which is about all these bizarre and weird animals, or If I Ran the Zoo, which is all McGilligot's Pool, where the guy says he thinks in this little mud puddle there's going to be thousands of incredibly fascinating fish, and he goes through what they might be. I preferred those to the later works that are just kind of didactic, which I can understand why they're their point. And they make good graduation gifts because you're going to go out and have a nice future. But what I liked about the early books, they were very specific about creating and the creative process, and they were all about just creation. Now, there's a problem with that because the early Seuss also is part of it. It's locked in its own history. It's locked in the history, and there are, of course, racist pictures in Dr. Seuss. There are some thematic things. With my own grandchildren, I wind up skipping pages often, but that kind of relates to to my novel. I'll tell you why when we talk about the novel. This notion of admiring works from a certain historical period, teaching works from a certain historical periods, mid 20th century, let's say, but also being aware that they're locked in that history and they carry baggage with them that it could be harmful in some ways, that there could be damage, there could be collateral damage if you try to imitate those works in a modern context.
Somebody told me once that you chew the meat and you spit out the bones when it comes to those kind of things. Do you think that's an accurate statement?
I think it's accurate. It's baby and bathwater stuff too. This is another axiom. Yes, I do agree with that. But it's also like handling flammable or explosive materials. You want them in the hands of someone who knows how to render them and deal with them, and so that's that I think that's what makes a professional educator a professional educator in some ways. And as a writer, I like to think I have more free reign to do whatever I like, and if it's problematic, it's problematic, which is an issue, because as a former educator, I don't live in the community that anymore that I taught in for 3 years. I did live in that community too, but I go back to the bookstore in our old town of Schenectady when I have a new book, and I'm hailed as a hero, as a former educator writes books. But I don't really worry about it. I could worry about it if I wanted to, but there's sex in my books. There's violence in my books, and I'm concerned sometimes that what happened to good old jolly Doc Wolos, with some of these things we're reading. And I had to make a decision about that somewhere along the road. Was I going to be fearless, or was I going to say, well, I can't write this because somebody might think that? But my choice was to be fearless, is pretty much the epigraph of almost every book I send out comes from Kafka. It's along the lines of, a literary work should be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea inside us. And the things I write, rather than just being entertaining, I like to think shake people up sometimes, and shake up the mind, just to present a new perspective on things. So that's sort of where I go on that.
So, what are the hardest topics that you feel kind of shake us up?
Good question. Um, those that require honesty, those that might subvert how we usually think about things. Um, if we're too locked in at looking at certain ways of being, um, I'll usually have my character do just the opposite. So here's an example of how I would like begin a new story. If I look through my journals and I keep them, and I would recommend to new writers, and there's more to discuss on that too, but I would suggest to new writers that you've got to keep some sort of notebook with you always, that you jot down observations, that you position yourself as an observer at all times, even when you're just having a normal conversation or being part of anything. You're always also observing yourself in that context, observing everything else. So everything I have is in my notebook. If I'm thinking of a story, I'll flip through
Mhm.
my notebooks and I'll look for things that not necessarily connect, but maybe connect in the way that I can make a connection. In other words, they might collide, they might vibrate. It's sort of like little kids taking different kinds of bugs and putting them in a jar and looking to see what will happen. And that's what I'll do. So the I don't find anything particularly hard to write about. It's more thinking about, and it's more writing process stuff that becomes hard. And it's, uh, would you like to hear about my writing process?
I would very
I love to
much.
talk about my writing process. Um, so I'll do something like I just said, pick a couple of things to write about, have an idea to begin generating words, because that's the most important thing. Is if you're going to be a writer, you got to write. You can't say, I'm going to think about the whole story first, and then it's going to be completely preformed in my head, and then I'm going to put it down on paper, because for me, that doesn't work. Everybody needs to develop their own kind of process. This is mine. Let's say I'm going to write a 20-page story. It's my goal, a 5,000 word, 20-page story, standard length story. I'll probably write 50 pages first. I'll just begin a draft, 50 pages. And what I'm doing when I do that is looking for what's going to be the heart of the story. And somewhere in those 50 pages, I say, okay, this is it. This is what the story is about. And I'll cut out the rest, start another draft, rewrite everything. I think it's almost never out of those 50 pages does a sentence, even a single sentence, remain the same as it will appear in the final draft. And then it's just a matter of drafting, consolidating, until it's brought down to what the size, the length, that it delivers its message, or delivers whatever I want to happen with as much impact as it can in the shorter form. But that's it. Drafting. It'll take me, I mean, I've got a lot of stories written, but it takes me about a month and a half to write a story. And that's like full-time work of working
Yes.
on a story.
Do you ever
Um,
notice when you're writing a story, do you know how the characters will end up, or does it surprise you? Like, do you?
I prefer it when it surprises me. It's like, oh, okay, so this is going to happen, and I'm aware that I'm in control of that, but it is more of a surprise. Sometimes I write towards an end, but not as often. And I read that a lot of authors do like to write towards the end. They know what the end is, and that's
Mhm.
what they move toward. I usually know what a situation is. So I'll take that situation and I'll say, well, what are going to be the ramifications of this situation? How is it going to play itself out?
How are
So
things going to pivot around that situation?
yeah, yeah.
Well, and tell us about your book, that your novel that's come out, Tings.
Okay. It's, The novel itself springs out of one of my pleasures as a child, which was like scary movies. I'm not a devotee of horror films as such, but I like big monster movies, the big monsters that would come. And so
King Kong.
yeah, absolutely, King Kong. So that's a good that's a good choice because the origin story of this novel was actually written in 1990. It was called Son of Kong, How Do You Do? And it was about a director who wanted to remake not King Kong, but the lesser known 1933 sequel, Son of Kong, where Kong's son is a littler ape, and he's white. And he winds up like saving the day as Kong's island ultimately is destroyed, but that ape dies himself. So I wrote this story. That director runs into all sorts of problems trying to do this he goes to an island to do it, runs in problems with the workforce there who are protesting because he wants to bring in his own islanders, and the islanders there say, well, wait a minute, we're here, why can't you use us? That kind of thing. The women on the island protest that there is no Mama Kong. So all kinds of complications he gets into in that story. Interesting thing, by the way, with that story is it was published in one of the first kind of online journals. It was published in Postmodern Culture, which came out of Johns Hopkins. And it was one of the first online journals there was that the source of that story. The story itself kind of got outdated and I wanted to rewrite it. Mm-hmm. So ultimately I rewrote it as a story called Svidrigailov's Dream. He's a Russian character from Crime and Punishment. Okay. In Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment. And Svidrigailov is a terrible guy. He's a noble who is kind of perverse and perverted, and he decides, I want to be good, so I'm going to be kind. And that's his new motivation for the rest of his life. So he goes to sleep. He has a dream, and in his dream, there's a little girl. A poor little girl outside the doorstep of his noble home. And he sees that she's hungry. He invites her in. She's hungry. She's tired. He puts her to bed. And he's very self-satisfied that he's accomplished this great goal. But when he turns around and looks at her, she's become like a prostitute, a painted prostitute, a painted woman. And we just see how debased this character is, that even when he's trying to be kind, all he can do is picture this poor child as a sexual object. He can't not do it. And ultimately he kills himself, but because he can't satisfy. So going back to the good old director who wanted to make a sequel to Son of Kong, in the new novel, he's done that. He's actually made Kong's daughter. He was enlightened. He makes and it's a huge success. He had made smaller slasher horror movies before that, but Son of Kong's daughter is a huge success.
Oh, good.
He decides after that, well, I'm such a good director now, I'm going to make small independent films. And his son becomes an actor, wants to be an actor, becomes an actor. They make an actor out of one of J.D. Salinger's short stories. They make a movie out of that. Teddy becomes a critical success. He says, man, I've got the mojo now. He decides that the perfect subject for a movie would be the chapter of Crime and Punishment, Svidrigailov's Dream. And he hires a little girl. You got to do this, you got to do that. Becomes a whole big problem. He winds up being accused of moral turpitude. His career goes straight down the toilet. Mm-hmm. The novel traces the rest of the history of this young girl, and that's one of the arcs of how. Remember what I said before about our literature and the things we read and the things that our dead white males may write about may cause damage and may cause collateral damage, because there are other characters in the novel, other characters who are also damaged through the narrative. Now, that's a lot, isn't it? So Tings, the title, because a lot of this is about creative people make monsters. Tings You've heard of Bela Lugosi, the guy who used to play Dracula in the old
Hmm.
movies. Well,
Hmm.
there's another old movie. He's in a horror movie. He's in a horror movie called Island of Lost Souls, which is based on The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. The Island of Dr. Moreau. That's where that crazy doctor on his own island
Hmm.
brings animals in and through vivisections, tries to make them humanoids. So he's like tearing these poor creatures apart to make them into animals. And at the end of the movie, which is based on the book, at the end of this movie, the Isle of Lost Souls, the humanoid animals revolt against Dr. Moreau. They chase him down, they surround him, and Bela Lugosi, who doesn't look slick like Dracula, he's not all dressed up. He's a beast man. He is the beast man. His hair is sprouting from his face, and they've got Dr. Moreau held down, and he points to Dr. Moreau and he says, "We are not men, we are things. We are not beasts, we are things. You made us things." And that's where the title comes from. And the piece I'm going to read a little later is a chapter. The first time in the novel, we actually meet the young girl. She's now in her mid to late 20s. She's had a career that's she's a tarnished celebrity, let's say. And she's coming out of rehab in the chapter we see. And she's about to, well, when I read it, you'll see what she's about to do. But that's the idea of the novel, that there's a lot of danger in what we read from past novelists. And you see the relationship back to Dr. Seuss, even, where you have to be careful with what you do, because what you're handling, there's a lot of potential
Damage.
damage that can be done from that. The way that director has since died. The one who abused her is at least verbally and psychologically. I think
Psychologically, yes.
there's definitely psychological abuse. The son has also grown up, and he's going to appear later in this chapter, but you're not going to see him this time. There's a reference to him. So in this chapter, which is called Dr. Moreau's Pet Shop, and we're seeing the character of Amabel Hadley, seeing her actually in person, though she's been referred to constantly throughout it. She's the subject. This is the first we're seeing of her, and she's in her late 20s now, and she's coming out of rehab. All right, she's on her way out of rehab. So I'll start reading. Is there such a thing as being fresh out of rehab when it's your sixth time? Amabel asked as she settled into the bucket seat of her red convertible, coaching the B-list reporters who followed her after she'd signed herself out of the facility. Maybe say rotten out of rehab, or spoiled, or stale out of rehab, Amabel Hadley. In her condo, an odor of something neglected in the refrigerator lingered, and that was exactly how she felt. Stale, detached from the thickened figure facing her in the bedroom mirror. She wouldn't even try to lose the rehab donut weight this time. There seemed no point in whittling herself down to a self so easily condemnable. With less effort, she could crop her hair, maybe brutally short. The new look would match the voice that countless cigarettes had scrubbed into a growl. Amabel's harsh and court-ordered abstinence from outside communication was over, and her agent had left word about a job on her voicemail. P.P. Frederico is making The Island of Dr. Moreau as a full-length animated feature. He wants you to voice a character named Maling. I told him you'd be thrilled. Amabel hadn't been so sure. She'd seen enough has-been actresses lose themselves in the world of animation. Usually they'd be animals, gloriously feathered and distinctively beaked birds, sinuously waisted minks, cobras hooded like Cleopatra. That were all sad memorials to faded careers. She'd be turned into a cat, Amabel guessed, with huge green eyes, a whiskey purr, and a slender body. For a cartoon, no one needed to trim down, either by exercise or diet pills or a finger down the throat. A Moreau script was delivered, but Amabel didn't bother to read it. She knew the story. A crazy doctor on a remote island operates on animals, trying to turn them into human beings. Her character's name, Mling, hinted at a wickedly seductive antagonist, maybe with a vaguely threatening Middle Eastern allure. Too late in the arc of her reputation to give her voice to a heroine. It wasn't until the telephone interview arranged by the studio, a week before a recording was to start, that Amabel discovered what she'd gotten herself into. The interview began with the usual questions about her rehab stint and her legal trouble. Did she think she'd stay sober this time? Would she think twice before threatening to light a pool of gas at a fuel pump? Would she consider an apology to PETA and the vegan coalition she had enraged with her observation that, quote, only stupid people don't eat meat. Meat, including brains, is brain food. Even zombies know that, end quote. Curled up on her bed in sweatpants and a too snug t-shirt from her own scaredy cat line for tweens, she watched herself yawn and smoke in her dresser mirror as she asserted her, quote, every confidence and hope, end quote, that her new sobriety would lead to better future decisions. Amabel considered herself adept at deflecting awkward questions provocatively, yet insubstantially. When asked what she thought Peter's take on her involvement with P.P. Frederico's Moreau project would be, she saw the languorous drag she took from her cigarette and the careful way she patted the bed around her hips for the Snickers bar she'd half unwrapped before the call. She could still mesmerize herself with her own eyes, though at the moment they were no more bewitching than frozen peas. And when had her chin begun to melt into her neck? It's just a cartoon, she said. No animals, I can assure you, will be harmed during filming. The reviewer chuckled. Right. But since P.P. Frederico has already commented on his intentions of releasing this as the first graphically violent cartoon in the history of cinema, a shocking, I think was the word he used, do you get the feeling you were cast because of your comments on me? Amabel watched her brow furrow, thought worry, and deepened the frown. Cigarette ash dropped onto her chest into the open green eye of her t-shirt's winking scaredy cat logo. The identical logo was tattooed in color on the small of her back. You mean, do I think it's unusual for a filmmaker to inspire interest in his film by introducing a note of controversy? Animals surgically altered, torn apart by Dr. Moreau and reconstructed as humanoids, deformed, suffering creatures treated first as experiments, then as slaves by the evil doctor. The reporter seemed to be reading this from a press release. What cartoon doesn't tear apart animals and make them half human? Mickey Mouse and Goofy and Bugs, they're freaks, right? Talking biped animals, bipedophiles, is that a word? No, but the film's theme seems to glorify suffering. It's a horror cartoon, and I like meat. Well, are you put off by the absence of a female presence in the film? I'm Mling. Right. The interview waited. Amabel traced a circle around her reflected face with her cigarette butt. She imagined herself with a snout and protruding yellow teeth, shivered, and looked away. Well, I'm sure that some suppressed sexual tension will bubble to the surface. Isn't that what horror films are all about these days? Red-lipped vampires burying their fangs into the necks of... Of course. But how do you feel about the fact that Mling is a male? Excuse me? How do you feel about the fact that for your first role in almost 4 years, you've been cast as a male? Amabel pictured her script, still in its FedEx envelope in the center of her black granite kitchen island. She wouldn't surrender the truth, that a career was in the toilet and that this was the only job she'd been offered. I'm sure it's integral to the film. Mr. Frederico is an artist, and a certain liberation from convention should be expected. Are we almost over? My publicist is pointing at her watch. I think I have an appearance at a charity event scheduled. Amabel watched the figure in her mirror tap her wrist. Just one more thing. What's your reaction to Carl Walchuk's involvement with the screenplay? You know, the Moreau project was originated with his father, right? The production is something like a memorial to Raymond Walchuk. He gave P.P. Frederico his start, after all. Do you know Carl? Not really. Maybe we met at some child star thing years ago before he quit acting. I don't remember if he was on the set of Svidrigaïlov's Dream, if that's what you're getting at. The whole mess with his father got settled, and everybody involved moved on. Raymond Walchuk is dead, right? I really got no comment beyond that.
So, Gregory, one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that it sounds like in your book is that you're really pointing toward exploitation of minors and just the generational cycle when it comes to breaking that for for kids and families, especially for parents. Um, how do you feel about the importance of breaking that generational cycle when it comes to what your characters are experiencing?
Well, I think it's very important. My characters have generally experienced some suffering, and often as a consequence of what their parents or mentors would have thought of with good intentions. Um, but there's something in the structure of, we talk about dead white males, we talk about and their agendas. We see it in our culture today. Um, and so, intent or not, damage is done, and we have to be aware of that. And I think that through my stories, I try to show the suffering of the characters, but I like that you need to leave a door open to point them toward what is it that sometimes it's the reader's own conclusion. Well, this was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
How was this all wrong? I used to love those books. Let's say I used to love those kinds of things. And as we talked about earlier, it's baby with the bathwater. It's bone without it's meat without the bone. Um, so proper instruction, proper interpretation. Uh, you
And
know,
it's
I
and it sounds like that what you hope to do though is that you want to provoke readers to actually think outside the box of what's happening, and
yes,
maybe in the future let's do better.
yes, absolutely. It's funny. I remember the first. I talked about Dr. Seuss, and yes, he had a great impact to me. But I remember one of the things I had older brothers, so the literature they read was always lingering around. And I was always reading it, and I was far too young to appreciate it. Um, so I read Catcher in the Rye when I was young. I didn't know what the heck they were talking about in it. I didn't know what was going on in Lord of the Flies. I think I read that and I was like 9, and it was like, what? But I figured it out, and those kinds of things hit me. And then the one that hit me the most was when I was in, I think, ninth grade, the summer between ninth and 10th grade. I read Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, and it's such a depressing. And it was then that I realized, hey, all stories don't end happily. What's going on? And I think that's where I kind of moved into my Kafka ice axe, breaking up the frozen sea inside us kind of thing. Because it's breaking up that frozen sea that gets that in the process of reading. That's what I'm trying to get at, I guess. In the
Mm-hmm.
process of reading, that enables us to see what we're doing, what's behind the mask of what we've been reading and doing in general, just in general. But there's something more that we need to be aware of to keep things healthy, I think.
And it sounds like that what you want aspiring writers, especially those who are writing novellas, is to be aware of that, and provoke your reader. It sounds like I think at one point you had said that it's almost like you're playing God. You decide how that is going to go. Um, Gregory, where can we find your work?
Oh, you can find my work online on Amazon. You can also go to my website, gregorywolos.com. And either sometimes it's nice to buy the work if somebody wants to through the publisher, because that helps that helps the small independent publishers, of course. Um, and yeah, that's how that
You're
would come.
also you have your own website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can go there. You can see what stories I've, the accumulation of the stories are there, and you can visit a lot of the stories there. Um, have access to a lot of the stories online there, or find out where you can get them over the years that are listed there. You can see what on the website. You can see what awards I have won. You can see what I've nominated for. You can see a picture of me holding a duck. Um,
And also you can go on YouTube as well. And I think we had talked about earlier that you're thinking about incorporating your YouTube videos that you've been, where you do actually read your work and put that on your website, which I
yeah, I
think will
think
be
that's a
really
good
cool.
idea. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
And I think especially, Gregory, since you are a grandfather, being able to actually see you in action and hear your voice reading your stories, I think that's going to be such a legacy for your family as you go on.
Oh, I
Um,
hope so.
I know so. Well, Gregory, thank you for spending time with us today. And
Okay.
we wish you all the very best in your writing future.
Thank you so much, Becky.